Well, thank you all so much for joining this presentation that I've entitled Protecting Our Hearts and Minds, Understanding Alzheimer's and Dementia in Black Communities. I want to talk specifically about how Alzheimer's disease and dementia, how they kind of have a unique challenge in the way that they affect Black communities. And once again, I'm a neuropsychologist at The Ohio State University, where I direct the Cognitive Health and Late Life Lab. And we are all about promoting brain health in communities that are at greatest risk for dementia, particularly in Black communities. And I also bring you greetings from the Alzheimer's Association. Some of you may know this, but the Alzheimer's Association has a national partnership with Alpha Phi Alpha, uh, uh, working to promote brain health and have educational seminars like this to bring awareness and hopefully bring treatments to Black communities so that we can cope better with this disease. This is a topic that's really personal to me. I've had three family members with Alzheimer's disease, one grandparent on both sides of my family, who have passed away from the disease, and I have an uncle living with it right now. So I've seen how devastating it can be to have someone in your family with Alzheimer's disease, and it's something we're going to hear about more over the next few years. The number of people living with dementia is expected to double by the year 2050. And so I think most of us in the room have probably been by it in some way. And unless we do something about it, it will likely become all of us who are affected by Alzheimer's disease or dementia in some way in one of our families or family members. But that risk isn't just the risk of getting Alzheimer's disease and the rate at which it will double or that we'll see an increased incidence isn't totally random. There are populations that are at higher risk, including Black Americans as well as Hispanic Americans. Women are also at higher risk in general, and we'll talk about more about specifically today why Black Americans are at greater risk. So, the three main questions I want to address today are what does Alzheimer's disease do to the brain? Secondly, why do Black Americans have an elevated risk for dementia? And then third, what are we doing to address brain health in Black communities, specifically here in Central Ohio? Dementia is the big umbrella term that we use for any loss of memory or other kinds of thinking abilities that basically are severe enough to interfere with a person's functioning in daily life. Alzheimer's disease is the most common cause of dementia. And so a person can technically be classified as dementia, or sometimes we use the term major neurocognitive disorder if they have something like a brain injury, car accident, and hit their head and are in a coma and are unable to function and live independently after that. That could be a form of dementia. You can have dementia for, having a stroke or multiple strokes, like vascular dementia, or Alzheimer's disease, where there's a progressive loss of ability over time, is probably the most common cause. I showed you some pictures like this last time. One of these is a picture of a brain with Alzheimer's disease, and the other is a healthy brain. You can see it's very tightly packed. You can see the brain looks healthier on the inside. There's not as many gaps between the different peaks and valleys of the brain. And that's exactly what we see in a healthy brain, that what we call the cerebral cortex, the outer surface of the brain, is folded and packed very tightly so that those brain cells are connected together. And you can even see this part of the brain down here, the hippocampus, which would be located here. You can see over here it's nice and full, and over here it looks like there's more gaps. So that indicates to us that there's been a loss or a shrinkage or a loss of brain cells, which is what typically happens in Alzheimer's disease. And these changes are caused by or are thought to be caused by the buildup of multiple substances. The key one that has been narrowed down is this substance called amyloid that gradually builds up and destroys connections between brain cells. And so you'll hear what's referred to as amyloid plaques that kind of hurt the communication between your brain cells. Your brain cells are kind of like hands touching like this and wanting to connect with each other and communicate. And amyloid gets in the way of that and breaks down the communication so that there's a loss of brain cells, the brain cells start to die, and then you lose the ability to remember things. It's literally as if parts of your brain are disconnected from one another. Probably one of the most important things I can share with you today is this complex slide, which is all to say that amyloid and Alzheimer's disease, there is a very long asymptomatic period. I may have
Mm,
mentioned this last time. I'm not sure if I did. So I'll say it again. You'll remember COVID-19. You'll remember that they had us quarantined for 14 days. Why? Because they knew that you could be asymptomatic. You could not show any symptoms. For something like 10 days to 14 days, maybe on the 13th, 14th day, you may have been infected on day one, but you might not show symptoms until 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 days, right? So there was about a 10 to 14 day asymptomatic period. There's many diseases that have long asymptomatic periods. Various cancers, it can take years where the disease is developing biologically before someone shows symptoms. In Alzheimer's disease, the asymptomatic period can be anywhere from 10 to 15, possibly even as many as 20 years. So if someone starts showing signs of Alzheimer's disease at 65, 70, maybe on a biological level, these things started, when they were 50, 55, 45 even, who knows? After decades of research, we're now just now scratching the surface on when Alzheimer's disease starts in the brain, but we know it's a very long time before someone really shows memory problems. So that really has some important implications for um, why Black Americans have an elevated risk for dementia and what we can do to address brain health and to promote brain health. So our second topic here, talking about specifically, given that we're here for Black History Month, given that I'm here talking to you all, Alpha Phi Alpha, why do we as Black people have to be particularly concerned about the risk for dementia? Why do we have an elevated risk? There's so much here. I'm going to try to condense it. I have a bunch of slides on this topic. Feel free to drop a comment in the chat or just raise your hand or just interrupt me if you have a question. In order to understand why Black Americans have an elevated risk, we have to understand risk factors for dementia in general. So I like to divide risk factors into kind of two categories. There's non-modifiable risk factors and modifiable risk factors. There's things you can't change about yourself that could put you at risk, and then there's things you can change. I want to talk about the non-modifiable ones first. The biggest risk factor for dementia is age, right? The older you are, the more likely, or the greater risk, the higher your risk for developing dementia. Now that I want to be clear about what I'm saying, dementia is not necessarily a normal part of aging, right? It's caused by some kind of disease. Just because you're getting older doesn't mean you have to develop dementia. Dementia does not have to be your destiny. But we do know that if you take, 150-year-olds and take a group of 180-year-olds, you're more likely to find people with dementia among the 80-year-olds. It's a disease that increases with the risk increases with age. Secondly, genetics. I know this is a big topic that we could probably have a whole evening about. There are certain genes that increase your risk of dementia. So that if you had a genetic test and you were to find out that you had a certain genetic profile, we might be able to give a little bit of information about whether you have a normal risk or a little bit of an increased risk. There's a specific gene called ApoE4, where if you have two copies of ApoE4 allele, you have a heightened risk of developing dementia. But as a little preview for what we might talk about in the future, people in this high risk group who have both copies of this allele are only about 15% of all the Alzheimer's disease cases that are out there. So, it's not 50%, it's not 8, it's not most people who have this high genetic profile. Genes aren't everything. Yeah, like they say, genes load the gun and your lifestyle pulls the trigger. There's so much more to Alzheimer's disease than just genes, but there are some genes that do put you at a slightly higher risk. And we also know that women have a higher risk than men. Part of that could be driven by women living longer in general. Part of that emerging research is also showing that it could be related to changes that happen during menopause. But a lot more research is needed to uncover that specifically. And then
Okay.
lastly, of the non-modifiable risk factors, I put a question mark next to race. Is race a risk factor? That's often how we talk about it. We often talk about race being the risk factor, but there's a lot more to it than that. And I'm sure many of you in the room are educated on this topic. One reason why we have that question mark is because these two findings, this gene that I mentioned earlier, uh, when Black Americans have this gene, have both copies of the allele for this gene, their risk of developing dementia isn't really that much higher. In white Americans, there's a much higher risk, but in Black Americans, having two copies of that allele doesn't increase your risk by that much. The link is much weaker. And then secondly, we also know that people with African ancestry have lower levels of amyloid, at least on PET scans, like was discovered in this study. Some more recent research has debated this, but overall, what we're seeing in different kinds of evaluating amyloid, we see that Black people in general have lower levels of amyloid. So that should be really confusing because on one side, I'm saying that we have a higher risk of developing Alzheimer's disease and perhaps other forms of dementia. But on the other side, the key substance that causes Alzheimer's disease is lower in people of African ancestry and Black Americans in particular. So that's a kind of confusing finding, and really suggests that, if it's not our biology that puts us at risk, then what is it? What else could it be that puts us at risk? In a nutshell, it has a lot to do with lifestyle, certainly, and some other factors as well. I'm going to show you some more brains on the screen this time. One of these is a normal brain. This is a MRI scan taken from the top of the brain, so looking down on someone's brain. Uh, and so on the left, you have a normal brain. On the In the middle, you can see a brain that has a little bit. You see how it has a little bit more spacing to it. So that's a brain with Alzheimer's disease. What about this one? You see these little areas here that are kind of lit up? Those areas that are kind of lit up on an MRI scan are what we call white matter disease. When there is some kind of disruption to the blood flow in the brain, there can often be seen on MRI scans these little bright spots that indicate that there is a weakening or some kind of other disruption to the blood vessels in the brain. And so we know that a person's risk for dementia is influenced by their lifestyle and environment, as you all highlighted. And particular for Black Americans, we know that any lifestyle factor that influences the uh, the flow of blood or the delivery of nutrients to the body or to the brain can also increase your risk for dementia. And so specifically, when we look at these modifiable risk factors now, these are things that are changeable or that are influenced through lifestyle. Things like high cholesterol, high blood pressure, diabetes, obesity, right? We all know someone in our families who's experiencing one of those chronic illnesses, and they're really silent killers. They're so common that we kind of just accept them as a part of daily life. But when uncontrolled or when not managed properly, these things can result in all kinds of bodily problems and problems with your brain as well. And I see someone mentioned in the chat regarding white matter disease or the white spots that happen in a person's brain. Yeah, you can see a different kind of white spots in a person's brain when they have multiple sclerosis. Um, and relatedly, just as a quick aside, particularly among Black people with multiple sclerosis, we know that many of the same risk factors are at play. In fact, my dissertation was all about Black people with MS and how there are different outcomes in comparison to white Americans. So happy to chat more, Mr. Rogers, if you're interested. Stress of lifestyle, diet, food, environmental things, that these are all products of systemic racism. And it's exactly that. We know that a person's lifestyle doesn't just happen in a vacuum. We know that high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes, and obesity have a lot to do with a person's financial resources, healthcare resources, social resources, their environment, their built environment, and what's near them and what's accessible to them nearby, wherever they live or wherever they work or wherever they worship or play. And so the social determinants of health are really, really what we believe are driving this increased risk of dementia in Black Americans. And so, as one example, there's been plenty of research recently on the effects of living in a disadvantaged neighborhood. So, various metrics of how advantaged or disadvantaged a neighborhood is. We know that living in a disadvantaged neighborhood is associated with a smaller hippocampus size, so that part of the brain that controls memory. We see that in older adults that shrinks more or is smaller in people who live in these disadvantaged neighborhoods, and that living in a disadvantaged neighborhood is also associated with faster cognitive decline over time in older adults. And more often than not in the U.S., it's us who are living in these disadvantaged neighborhoods, and it's not totally random. It's not just by choice, right? We know that there are all kinds of historical forces at play here, really at the top of the list, systemic racism. I did my PhD in Detroit, and so I got to know the history of Detroit pretty well. And you can see over here a redlining map from the 1930s, and you can see in green the areas of the city that were kind of advantaged and the areas of the city that were disadvantaged or predominantly Black or allowed to be disenfranchised. And you can see that in comparison to 2020, these are the same areas that are affluent or disadvantaged today. Here's a map that you might all recognize a little bit more, looking at a redlining map from the 1930s versus this metric of neighborhood disadvantage today. Yeah, you can see same pattern that we see across so many cities in the U.S. That living in these areas that were formerly reserved for predominantly white people are places where today people have better brain health outcomes, and places that were redlined or that were disadvantaged back then are also the places where people have worse brain out health outcomes today. And so related to where a person lives is another factor that no one's mentioned yet. Um, in the U.S. in particular, we know that where a person lives has so much influence on not only the things that can that make them healthy on a day-to-day basis, but also their access to things for the future. In particular, education, educational and employment opportunities have a lot to do with where you live. We know that education is an important way to challenge your brain, and challenging your brain strengthens the connections between brain cells. And so people with low education are at greater risk for developing dementia than people with better education. And it's really not really just about the number of years you've been in school. It's really about the quality of the education. So we know that people with high education quality have more opportunities to challenge their brain, have stronger neural networks, and their brains will be more resistant to disease versus people who have lower education quality, less good opportunities to challenge their brains. And their brains over time, we see this all the time, that they'll be less resistant to any disease. And so, more often than not, when we look at Black communities, we have a greater proportion or a greater share of people who have low education quality. Once again, not out of choice, not out of desire, but often due to these structural forces of systemic racism affecting us all these decades later. Some interesting research that's been done on this topic has shown that there's even influences or relationships between segregation and brain health. So, for example, we all know Brown versus Board of Education and how the decision to integrate schools led to some changes in access to higher education, higher quality education. So, Black children living in the South who didn't have access to the same kinds of resources at some other schools were allowed to integrate and get into some schools with some better resources, presumably, or with a better standing. And the research done years later, decades later, has shown that Black older adults who only attended segregated schools had worse cognition than those who only attended integrated schools. And which kind of makes sense, right? That those who only were, or it'll make sense in a moment, but those who only stayed in a Black only school had worse cognition than those who only attended integrated schools, where presumably there were better resources. But interestingly enough, those who transitioned from a segregated school to an integrated school, particularly in this middle school age range, had worse cognition than those who only attended integrated schools. So let me say that another way. So if you were, a Black child growing up in the South and you moved from an all-Black school to an integrated school, particularly in that middle school age range, then you actually had worse outcomes than those who just were always in an integrated school. Um, I guess for a person's entire schooling. And one of the ideas there is that, the transition to an integrated school, even though it may have better resources than a segregated school, the stress of being in a school where you might be one of the few people who looks like you, the discrimination, the bullying, the teasing, all the things that would get in the way of your learning, and all the mental toll that it would take to transition from a school where everyone looks like you to a school where, particularly back in the 50s and 60s, where people would openly discriminate against you, that stress plays a part and actually shows up in differences in risk for dementia and cognitive performance later on in life, all these decades later. And so there's certainly biological factors at play, high cholesterol, high blood pressure, diabetes, as well as these barriers to education that are also at play. But we also have to take into account the social and the mental health aspects. We know that people who experience greater levels of stress, like was mentioned in the chat earlier, as well as high levels of depression and social isolation, these can also be risk factors for dementia. In fact, a study that I had the opportunity to be a part of showed that in a very large sample of people, Black older adults who had depression and white matter disease had 9 times higher odds of being diagnosed with dementia than those who had neither risk factor, and greater odds than those who only had depression and only had white matter disease. You can see here when you had the combination, your risk of developing dementia was a lot higher. And so there's perhaps this interaction between the mental health aspects and the biological aspects of developing dementia that applies specifically to Black communities. So I've mostly given bad news thus far. I want to hopefully talk about some good news. If not, get to the good news. We'll get to all the good news today, but maybe in a future session. I have some good news with a little bit of an asterisk to it. The little good news is that it's a really exciting time for this field of research. Um, between there are basically no new medications for about 20 years when it comes to treating Alzheimer's disease, or no medications that showed any effectiveness at slowing down disease progression. And in the past 5 years, we've had 3 new medications. So there's a lot of hope on the horizon. Now, I put a little asterisk next to that for a few different reasons. One reason is that the first medication that came out, is no longer available on the market. There was lots of controversy about it getting approved by the FDA. People felt like the evidence wasn't strong enough. But good news is that there's 2 medications that have been approved by the FDA since then. But they have some really, really important limitations. The first is that there are rare but very severe side effects that can happen. People can have brain swelling, they can have brain bleeds, particularly people who have that genetic profile with ApoE4 who are in that higher risk category. Those people are at higher risk tend to have or a greater risk of having adverse outcomes because of this new medication that they're taking, and it's something that's an injection that they receive via infusion. So that's one limitation. The other limitation to all of this research is that there are very few Black participants in any of these studies. So probably the most successful trial or the most successful medication thus far, this drug called lecanemab, right? It was something like 20 Black people that the final study that got approval was based on, right? Just 2.3% of those almost 900 people. And there's so many reasons for that I'm sure hopefully we'll get a chance to discuss. The lack of credibility that these research institutions have in Black communities, and also some other scientific reasons why. Oftentimes, Black participants are systemically excluded from some of these research studies because they are looking for people with pure Alzheimer's disease. They don't want people who have Alzheimer's disease and some white matter disease like the picture I showed you, which more often than not happens to be Black participants. But the crazy thing about that is as research has evolved, we know more now that it's very rare to find really true cases of pure Alzheimer's disease. So it's really a bias that needs to be addressed. And then the third really, really important limitation, particularly if you have a family member showing signs of memory loss or anything like that, is that these new drugs are only effective in the early stages of Alzheimer's disease. They're not effective when someone is in the, moderate or severe stages of dementia. They're really designed early on in the process, and they, at best can show that they can slow disease progression by about 6 months at a time. And more often than this is particularly important for us because Black Americans tend to be diagnosed later in the disease process when these drugs are not effective. I can't tell you the number of patients I've seen, over and over again where I can remember being at a clinic where um, when we went out to the suburbs and we're doing assessments on people and testing their thinking and memory, in the predominantly white suburbs of Detroit, people were always in this kind of range. They're kind of always, oh, I think there's a memory problem, but I'm not sure. Many of them end up being normal. Some of them show very, very mild signs. And then when I was evaluating predominantly Black participants in more inner city areas, so often we weren't seeing people with mild dementia or moderate. It was already at the severe stage that people weren't seeking help until it was very much too late. I can remember during my training in Florida having a presentation like this, we had a whole documentary screening, got all the we got some of the sororities out and had a big event at our local Black History Museum. And then the next day I was in clinic testing this woman who was right here in the severe dementia stage and just couldn't even complete a single test that we wanted to give her. And so there's so much of a need for breaking down the barriers to getting people care. So in summary, talking about why there's an elevated risk for Black Americans, we have greater exposure to things that increase the risk of dementia, living in a disadvantaged neighborhood, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, these cardiometabolic diseases, and we have less exposure to things that help reduce the risk of dementia, having better education quality, and are also underrepresented in these research studies. And other things, unequal healthcare quality when we go to the doctor, more discrimination on a population level when we go to the doctor. We tend to be diagnosed later and less likely to benefit from new medication. And then part of it is our own responsibility. We don't like to talk about it. Oftentimes we don't like to talk about it. And I applaud you all for inviting me back to come speak about it and break that stigma. And overall, the leading researchers in this area just have just said that, we just don't know enough about how Alzheimer's disease affects Black people specifically. There's so much more that we need to know. And so I want to finish off with just talking briefly about what are we doing to address these problems? What are we doing to address brain health in Black communities? So talking about Central Ohio specifically, I've had the opportunity to be part of this group called the Alliance for Diversity and Brain Health in the Central Ohio Community, ad hoc, which is a group of organizations coming together to try to change these statistics and try to get people either into research or into the care programs that they need to care for their loved ones who might be experiencing memory loss. One of our members is also here. I took the liberty to invite Ms. Kim Wilson Lawson, who's from the who directs the African American Alzheimer's and Wellness Association, a fantastic resource for anyone who has a loved one experiencing memory loss, connecting you to resources for caregivers and support groups and other resources that she can perhaps talk more about in a moment. Some other work that we've been involved in. So my research lab has collaborated with several different organizations, including you all, the African American Male Wellness Agency. We had a presentation with Omega Psi Phi earlier this month, and also UARC, the Urban Aging Residents Coalition, and some other groups to really get the word out and really put on these kinds of educational presentations. So you've seen one of them from the Alzheimer's Association, 10 warning signs. You've had this one today. We do have another presentation, probably my favorite presentation, Healthy Living for Your Brain and Body. How do we take what we know about healthy living and about these modifiable risk factors to not just not just talk about the things that put us at risk, but what are the things that can help reduce our risk or help build resilience against these disorders um, uh, uh, or help prevent them in the first place. And so I'd love to come back and talk more about that if you all are willing. But in the meantime, I also want to highlight some work that my research lab is doing. I received a grant from the Alzheimer's Association to help give these kinds of educational presentations and also to do some memory screenings. So we have a study, we call it the AMEN study. We are assessing memory in every neighborhood. We are interested in seeing how a person's neighborhood and their social determinants of health relate to their cognitive abilities as well as their attitudes towards participating in research in the future. And so we have the study going on. You can scan this QR code, or I can send the flyer out after this meeting, where you can go to our website. And there's two parts to this study. There's a memory screening that you have to print out. It's on paper and pencil. And it takes about 15 minutes to complete and just has some various thinking and memory activities and a little puzzle problem solving activity at the end. We also have some questionnaires that you'll see through the link on our website, asking different questions about mental health, social determinants of health, transportation, access to healthcare. There's a quiz to see how much you know about Alzheimer's disease, and some other questions to see what your attitudes are, what you might be interested in, or what some barriers might be related to participating in research. The overall goal for my research lab is that we want to design some programs, some interventions to help promote brain health that work in our communities, particularly in Black communities here in Central Ohio. So if you're interested in this, feel free to email me, call me, or take a look at our website. Everyone who completes the study can get $20 in e-gift cards, $10 for each part listed there. So I'm happy to talk about that more. So with that, I want to open up the floor to any questions. So you have about 15 minutes left. Feel free to scan the QR code. Feel free to take our contact information. Also want to mention the 24-hour helpline that the Alzheimer's Association have. If you know anyone who's experiencing memory loss or who's been diagnosed with dementia and just are looking for direction, this is the best number to call. And highlighting the contact information for our local African American Alzheimer's and Wellness Association as well.